Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I'm seeing that maybe the feed isn't going too well today, but hopefully you can still just hear me. You don't need to see me. That's not the important part. But we'll get started today. We're expecting a lot of snow this weekend, so a lot of folks are chatting up online about um, how we used to uh, plow the sidewalks and things, and that might be an interesting topic for future. But it does remind me of a time where we've gotten used to snow plows and being able to get from one place to another. And perusing old newspaper articles and things, you'll discover that people pull out the sleigh back in the 1800s, even early 1900s, and roads were not plowed. So actually, major roads were. If we had a major storm like the one we're expecting this weekend, you wouldn't be able to get from point A to point B. Seneca Street actually is a good example. There would be reports in the newspaper of basically us being snowed in from Buffalo and vice versa. You could still take the train, but the roads would have been clogged and there wouldn't have been as much of the plowing that we get today. So just be thankful for what we do have. The storms are not fun necessarily, but we do have a lot more technology and able to get from point A to point B much easier than our forefathers and mothers were able to do. Another thing people have been asking about, and thanks for the comments, I see as we are each week doing this, we get more and more comments and feedback, which is wonderful. About ways to the best websites to do your research, and a lot of folks, probably one of the top things that people are researching is genealogy, but it could be a number of other things. Not only your family history, but if you're trying to find a person, a place, or a thing from the past, and you'll immediately go online to do it. Ancestry.com is, of course, one of the top ones, and that's a good one. A lot of them are subscription based, so meaning you have to pay to get on. But there are a couple other great ones as well. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's called. They put out a really good genealogy website, and they have volunteers across the country who go through microfilm and microfilming things and now digitizing things. And it's familysearch.org. If you, that's another great one. I use that one all the time. I find it easier than Ancestry, but of course, I think it's just go on to whatever website you feel comfortable with, and not every website's going to be the favorite for everybody. In addition to just Ancestry, I used it for. I use a variety of websites just for my research. A perfect example was a couple months ago when I was researching Vera Wood, who was the daughter of the Easter Advertiser publisher, who sort of became a mascot for the Easter Advertiser when she was photographed in the early 1900s at about age 3 or 4 years old, holding her dad's newspaper. And then her photo had been used later for promotional campaigns for the Easter Advertiser. I wanted to figure out where she went because we've been talking for years about, and even when I worked at the Easter Advertiser, we've been talking about what happened to Vera Wood. Well, I was able to track her down, and I can actually I'll post the article again if you want to read it. And she moved out of state essentially, and I had to find into Stamford, Connecticut, actually. And I thought, well, I'll just see if I knew she had. I knew she had moved to Stamford, so I looked up. I basically just Googled Stamford newspapers and was able to find a digital archive of her newspapers, of the newspapers from Stamford. So I had to pay for it though. So it wasn't obscure. It wasn't Ancestry. It wasn't newspapers.com. It wasn't one of the prominent newspaper sites. It was some other one, and I was able to take advantage of the trial membership for a month, and got all the information I needed, and was able to figure out where her life took her, and activities that she was involved in. So sometimes you just got to Google. So like if you track down somebody and you track them down to a town or a small city somewhere, and that city has a newspaper, there might be a historical society there that has digitized the newspapers. There might be a statewide newspaper website. You just kind of gotta, there's not one size fits all, and not all the newspapers are in one place. There are copyright issues. There are just availability issues. So sometimes you just have to do the search online and find the place and take advantage of trial memberships, or sometimes you just have to pay for it because it costs money to digitize these newspapers. And especially if it's a place like a historical society or a nonprofit, just be okay paying for the access because they've had to pay for that to get it digitized. It's not necessarily cheap. We've done that here in East Aurora with a lot of digitizations of not just newspapers and other things, but we rely on donations. We haven't used taxpayer dollars so far to digitize these things. So so just think of that as you're doing your research online. The thing to be careful about with Ancestry and other sites like that is everyone likes to put together their family tree, and some of the websites, especially Family Search and Ancestry, they like to put make it easy for you to access other people's trees. So basically borrowing their research, and it'll give you hints and tell you might be related to this person. But you have to be careful to check the sources. You're relying on someone else's family tree and their research. And one wrong move and you are related to people you're not related to. So just be careful with that. Check the sources that are behind those family tree members that you're clicking on, because sometimes they're not the right person. And a lot of times there's people out there with the same name, even born in the same year and born in the same place. My mother, for instance, her name was Nancy Yox, and there happened to be another Nancy Yox here right in East Aurora, and it was a cousin, but in a family tree situation, she comes up, it suggests her as my mother on Ancestry, the wrong one. And then if I click and say that's a relative, then it tells me I'm related to people I'm related to, but not in the way that that the Ancestry is telling me. So be very careful with that. Be sure to check the sources of the primary sources behind each of the family tree members. So speaking of research, I know we've talked in weeks past about certain historical topics and events and themes from history. But one of the questions I've gotten recently, and I get a lot, is about doing your own research, and if you have a project and you're looking up things. And one of the big questions, aside from genealogy, that I get as a historian is how do I find out who lived in my house, or who owned my house, or who built my house? Basically, the history of my house. And so I wish there was a book that of the history of every single house and property everywhere, not just here in East Aurora. But there isn't. And sometimes you need to do your own research to figure it out. And that's part of the fun. A lot of times people would love to have the book come out, here's the file on your house and it tells you everything you need to know. But that's not how it works. And sometimes you have to do your own digging to find out. So you can look at maps, you can look at property records, but the first stop you should have when you are researching your house is a document called your search and title. And I have mine right here, and it's a very thick document, generally. And what this document is, and you should have gotten it if you own your property, and when you closed on your property, your real estate attorney will generally insist that there's a title search done on the property. Legally, this is super important because it basically ensures that every owner before you had the right to sell it to the next owner, because you certainly don't want someone from 1855 showing up claiming your land. And so they do their best to make sure that every person who passed the title of the property to the next person had the right to do so, and that there aren't any problems or any claims that might come out of the woodwork to your property that you are purchasing. And that's also why we often buy title insurance for our properties, because just in case there's an issue, not generally with the whole parcel that you're buying, but there might be an issue with the property line and things like that. So legally, this document is really important. But from a historical standpoint, it's invaluable, because what this document does is, and again, it's really usually thick and there's a lot in there, is it tells you every person who owned your property before you, dating back. Sometimes it's different, but generally, most of them that I have seen go back to, especially in Western New York, but in other areas it might be some different time period. Ours generally go back to the Holland Land Company, which is a company that was essentially given control of Western New York and sold property to settlers. And from there, it basically traces every single owner dating back to then. And what's very intriguing about it is most often it has, because it's a title search, will have the exact date of the transactions and the names of the people involved. So when folks come in and ask me in the aisles at the grocery store if I could help them with their with the history of their house and where do they go look to find the history of the house, I said, well, you probably already have it in your hands, or at least close by. If you don't have your search and title, your real estate attorney probably does. They don't always let us walk away with them. Mine did not. They like to hold on to it because they're very, very difficult to replace and very expensive to replace. So step one is, if you want to research your house and find out who owned your home or your property, is to get a hold of this. If you have it in your safe deposit box, or call your real estate attorney if you don't know where it is, and it'll have it's easy to identify because it basically has you can tell it'll have all the owners, and then it'll have the dates of transactions and any notes, and when it was filed with the county clerk's office. That may be different than the actual transaction date. When it was filed comes sometimes quite a bit later, especially in the early days of your property. So get a hold of it and make a photocopy of it and put the original back where it belongs safely, because again, it is very difficult to replace. And the great thing about having a photocopy, and yes, it's sometimes a lot of paper, but the great thing about having a photocopy is that you can write notes all over it. So as you're doing your research, you can write notes right on it. And that's what I did. So I have a copy. Again, my real estate attorney, when we purchased our property, would not let me take the original, and I'm glad for that. And they keep it in a safe place. And then I had the copy in order to do my research, and actually made several copies, one to put away so I have it, and then one for research. Someone had said to me once they did that, and then they looked it over, and they had a lot of trouble reading it. And because it does sometimes get complicated. It'll say person A sold the property to person B, and then it looks like they sold it back to the person. There are mortgages in there. There are wills. If someone passed away, a previous owner of your property died and they had to probate a will, that will be in there as well. So that's interesting, but it can also get very confusing. So what I did, and what I suggest to a lot of people, is take this document, go through it, and create either an Excel spreadsheet or just another piece of paper where you're basically making a timeline of your property. Don't sit there trying to do your research based off of this very long document that gets very confusing. Sit down and try to figure out, and it's actually easier than you think. Looking at it, it seems very cumbersome and complicated, but once you sit down and start looking at the dates and who sold to who, you can figure out which ones are the mortgages and which ones are, you can figure it out. It just takes some patience and time to sit down and actually look through it and come up with a timeline. So get a concrete timeline, and you can do that. I did mine in an Excel spreadsheet, and I know a lot of people who had done that, or just write it out, starting with the beginning and as you go through. And you'll also notice in there sometimes that there are splits and the properties have changed over time. Either pieces have been added on to the original lot or sold off. So there's sometimes you have to be patient with that and try to figure that out. But do the best you can with that, because that step will lead you to, once you have the names and the dates of transactions, is going into either Ancestry.com, any of the sites online where you want to do some research, or stopping into your friendly town historian or a historical society, place that has an archive, a local archive, and you already have the names of the people you're looking for and the dates of the transactions. Because a lot of times houses and properties are not cataloged in any archive by the address. So you can't just plug in your address into a database somewhere and find the whole history of your house. The reason being is addresses are fairly new phenomena, especially if you live outside a city or a village. A lot of places didn't have an address in the beginning, and so you won't be able to find it in early newspapers or things based off of the address. But you would be able to find it by the person who lived there and their name. So that's one reason why it's good to have a list of the previous owners. Second is addresses change. So be careful of that. The address you have today on your property is probably 100% probably not the address that it's always had. In fact, here in the village of East Aurora, before 1926, actually we know it was June of 1926, they had a haphazard address system. So two houses next to each other might have completely different numbers. So in June of 1926, they probably because the post office or emergency services required, they came up with a grid for the village. So you'll notice that like if you're on a 450, the road right north or south of you will, in the vicinity will also be 450 or around 450, and the grids will go in the village that way. So but people researching their houses often have looked, they'll find an old obituary of someone who lived in their house and it'll have an address. I had someone call me actually from their cell phone and say, was this house, they were at the end of Walnut. They were standing at Walnut and Linden Avenue here in East Aurora, and they had thought the house had been torn down because the house number they were looking for wasn't there. Well, in fact, they were looking at the old number. They had an obituary of a family member, but it was from before 1926. So they were looking for a house that they thought didn't exist, when in fact it just had a different number on it, and we were able to find it. So be careful when you do that too, that addresses aren't always the same. One of the great things we do have is a Sanborn insurance map. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but a Sanborn insurance map that has both sets of numbers, so we can match up and figure out which house today has what the old number was for a house. So with your search and title, you can look through family files online. If you have names, it just helps you really know who owned your house before you. So that just opens up a lot of research capabilities. Now, because I'm the town historian and I help people a lot with their research for their houses, you don't 100% need this search and title in order to research your house. But it makes it a whole lot easier to research, because it basically narrows down the search. And you can confirm with the maps. If you have a name and a date range of when they owned the house, you can confirm it with the maps. You can sort of do a timeline from maps, but it's just so much easier for this to be the starting point. So sometimes people will come in, or they'll talk to me about starting research of their house online. And I said, well, that's great, and I'm glad you're starting, but if you, it is worth the trouble to get the search and title first, because you'll be going down rabbit holes without that, and it'll avoid needlessly going down roads that lead you to not the right people. So step one, get that search and title. The one thing about the search and title we have to be careful about, though, is that it's the land. It's not your house. So sometimes houses were moved. A lot of times houses were moved. Actually, it's quite often. either they put a highway through or they were putting a parking lot in and they moved the house. So that sometimes causes some difficulty. So you just have to remember that. Um, and another thing is that it doesn't tell you when the house was built, but there's tax records that you can use to find out when your house was built. And actually, anybody in Erie County, an easy site is erie.gov. And right at the top of the site, it says real estate. And if you click on that, you can look up any property. And a lot of them have the year built right in right in the description. So that gives you what the tax records say when your house was built. And then you can go into your search and title and find out who owned it on that date and figure out, what who was there and essentially who built the house or who the house was built for. Some of the neat things in the search and title, and you have to be very careful, is you're going to find out things that you may not want to know. So you have to be prepared. So I'm going to just chat a little bit about and if you have any questions, let me know in the comments, any particular questions. But so on mine, I found out by doing that timeline that it starts out with the people who own the land. And of course, our housing lot is much smaller than what the original lot was. So Willem Willink, a lot of you from the towns in Western New York will see that name because he was a principal of the Hollow Land Company, sold it to somebody. And in our case, it was Timothy Payne, sold to Levi Pratt. These names might sound familiar because there's roads named after these folks. And they owned large parcels of land. And then it went to James Payne. And then there was a couple other people and a couple mortgages in there. And actually a will was filed. And then Henry H. Persons. Well, he didn't live in my house because the house wasn't built yet. But he owned the bank. And he was really involved in the bank. Well, all these people were pretty smart and made an investment. Okay, so he sold the property to what was known as the East Aurora Land and Improvement Company, which, again, because I see this in the search and title, I can go search either online or go to the Friendly Town Historian's office and say, what's Villa East Aurora Land and Improvement Company? And that was a housing developer, essentially. And so our property was part of that land development. And then they sold to an Elizabeth Rosencrantz, and with that name, cool name, I love that name, Rosencrantz. Her husband and August Rosencrantz was his name, and I did a little research about them and found out he was a Civil War veteran, and then they sold it to after they passed away, they sold it to their daughter, who I was able to research and find out she was the principal at the school. She was the elementary principal at what is today the middle school. And I was able to find their obituaries because I had their names in here. And then it goes on and on and on and tells you who bought the house and when. So we believe the Rosencrantz bought the house. It was one of the first houses in the East Aurora Land and Improvement Company. And so I learned all that from this document. I talked about you might find out some information you don't want to know. If you don't want to know who died in your house, just leave it at that and know their names. But when you look them up, for instance, I know 2 people died in my house, and they actually waked in the living room or the parlor. Today we call it the living room, but it was the parlor at the time, and it was in their obituaries in the East Aurora Advertiser that they were having the family was receiving friends at the wake in the house. And then the obituary said where they died, and they both Mr. Rosencrantz and then his daughter died in the house. So I'm okay with that. I'm cool with that, but some people don't want to know that. And again, you can do digital searches of your property through the names, you can also search. Some databases might have information about the address of your house, so you may be able to plug that in. But more often than not, you're going to find information based off the name, not necessarily the address. So that's why that search and title is important. Another source of information that's really neat, in addition to the family files, if you're going on Ancestry looking for the names from the search and title, are telephone directories. Archives have a lot of telephone directories, so you can, and a lot of the early ones have reverse lookup. So what today we get so used to the internet that we can just plug in a search and it'll find it. But they would actually have three different sections of the phone book. One would have everything alphabetized by last name. Another one would have it actually in numerical order by phone number. And then the last section was basically just streets addresses, and it would go like Main Street from the beginning all the way down Main Street, and it'd tell you who lived at each of the houses, and that's pretty invaluable. So some of those are online, but a lot of times you have to go to the archives. A good point to make is, as much as things are getting digitized, sometimes you just have to go. You have to go to the library. You have to go to the historical society, or call. Well, I know it's so old-fashioned, but I know people get frustrated sometimes trying to find things. But not everything is online, or it is online and it might be hard to find. And so you call your friendly town historian or a historical society or a library somewhere and actually talk to a human who works with all this stuff day in and day out. And they'll be able to help you. So sometimes just pick up the phone, because they may also give they may have documents or books or a resource that or know of a little newspaper that was published exactly in the time period that you're looking for, that isn't online or we don't know about. So just pick up the phone and call, and please be patient. A lot of these historical societies and places are part-time, operated by volunteers, so they can't turn things around very quickly, or it takes some time because things might not be cataloged perfectly. So just be patient with that. A lot of these great resources, local history resources especially, are just available in a historic archive that is not necessarily digitized yet, nor will be digitized in the near future. It does take money. It takes a lot of resources. So just remember that. A lot of times people ask me, well, why isn't this digitized? I'll say, well, there's a lot of things that go into digitization too, and making it available online. There's copyright issues and things like that too. So just sometimes you got to call and go in. And if you are nearby or can travel to an archive, going in and actually seeing the things in person, it's not a bad thing to do. It's a fun thing to do. So just remember that a lot of these archives are run by volunteer organizations, and they might not, be able to turn things around really quickly for you. But you might discover something that's been in a drawer for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, maybe even longer, and so that's the reward for your patience on that. Okay. Having a little difficulty here. Okay, there we go. We're back on track. So one of the things about, why is it important? One of the things that I get asked about a lot is that people are intrigued by their house. But why is it important to learn about your house history? Well, a lot of times some people are coming in to do a project, or they'll find something behind a wall and they just want to know about it, and they can figure out, maybe why someone, did something in the past. And so just putting together the story of your home is sometimes beneficial, practically speaking, not just the fun part of it. But it's just neat to know who lived in your house and loved it as much as you did. It's very kind of surreal to think that someone else was in your house and loved it just as much as you did. And we are only temporary caretakers of our property, which is kind of interesting, I think. One of the things that is a good resource too, if you're looking for how many stories, any additions to your house, or what the property lines look like in the past, because property lines do change. Neighbors have purchased or they've sold off lots, especially if you're out in more rural areas. There are Sanborn insurance maps that were published. The only problem with those, and we have a lot of those at the historian's office, and they're available online too. I think the Library of Congress or the National Archives has them. So if you just Googled East Aurora Sanborn maps, they'll come up. The only problem with those is they didn't really get into rural areas with those. They're, remember, insurance maps. So, for instance, we have insurance maps of like Main Street and some large portions of the village, and it'll tell you, what the house was made of, wood, concrete. Um, it will tell you how many stories each section was. It'll give you the property lines. It'll tell you if there's a water suppression or a security system, especially on the commercial buildings, which is great if that insurance map included your house. Those insurance maps, they wouldn't bother making a map of something that was either not insured or uninsurable. So things out in the country, they wouldn't necessarily have a map that had all those details on it. So it's hit or miss. So if you're lucky, your house might be on it, or it might not be. But that little bit of information from a construction standpoint gives you a lot of information. One of the things we laughed about was the Aurora Theater is on some of these insurance maps, and it said asbestos curtain. So the curtain at one time was labeled asbestos because that would be important to an insurance company to know, what things could possibly be a hazard. They of course didn't know asbestos back then, the hazard it was, but from a fire suppression standpoint, things like that. Some of them are really interesting. They'll have a note that says, night watchman at some of these lumber yards, especially. Again, that's an insurance thing that would have been important back then. But from a historic standpoint, it's really interesting to see, what buildings were made of. We were able actually to help someone who was wondering when an addition was put on their house. You can tell a timeline of that because the addition wasn't on one insurance map and then it was on the next one. So sometimes you can tell the story that way as well. So again, to recap a little bit, just remember, I know this was sort of a different topic this week. It's more of helping you do research of your house. I'm still learning a lot about how to do it. I'll come up with something and I'll think, oh, that's a resource I never thought of. But again, first things first is get your search and title for your property if you want to research your house, and then go from there. But step one, first stop, get the search and title, make a copy of it, and then you can have the names and the transaction dates of everyone who owned your property before you. This isn't a super secret document, so even if you rent the house and you asked your landlord if you wanted a copy of it, it's actually public record. They actually have it on file at the county. So if you're renting or you don't own the property you're looking for, we do have some properties in the archives, but every owner themselves should have one, and it's actually you probably in your hands, in your possession, have more information than an archive would. So it's a good starting point. So make the copy and get started with that, and that opens up a whole world of information that you can talk about to your friends about. It's a great conversation piece. People always want to know what. When the house was built, and when I start talking about the teacher who lived here and that sort of thing, it's kind of intriguing. And then also I was able to find on old maps that there was a greenhouse behind our house, which was interesting. Or there's just a lot that it opens up for you. One question, and I'll leave with this because I think it's very fun. A part of this is people ask me is like, can you tell me I have a ghost in my house, and can this process help me identify who the ghost is? Well, I guess, now, as historian, I can't tell you who your ghost is, so you're going to have to figure that out on your own. But we can certainly, from this process, tell you who lived in your home, perhaps. But remember, it's also who owned it. So the search and title tells you who owned it. So if there were any renters, that would not be included. But renters are often included on the phone books. And before phone books, they would have like a village or city directory. So sometimes we'll look at both and say, oh, well, the name in the directory is one and the owner is another one. And then you can probably try to see if they were renting the property. So again, piecing that story together. This takes time. It's not going to happen in an afternoon. So it's sort of like doing your genealogy. You're going to have to be patient, take time, and and you're always going to meet. You're never going to be done. So you're always going to be learning something new. Um, Oh, so great. Love those maps. Very informative for the village of Sherman. Yeah, Sanborn maps or any maps. So Erie County had put out a lot of, they would put out atlases. And they were money makers for a company to put out an atlas in the 1800s, early 1900s, and it would have all the names of the people on them. So we have atlases from 1909, 1880, 1866. There's certain years they put out atlases. So yeah, they are invaluable, and they have different information depending on what year. So the earlier maps don't necessarily have property lines. We also have a map from the 1850s that show some of the earliest property owners and the boundary lines. One of the things to remember is a lot of the times the lots that were delineated back during the Holland Land Company when they were selling to settlers, the lot numbers have stayed the same. So you can find on a modern map, a modern tax map, you can find where your property is, because sometimes it's hard to do it, especially out in the rural areas, because the roads aren't on the roads didn't exist necessarily on an early map. So again, it's just piecing this all together, and it is an adventure, and there's not necessarily a folder for every property that exists. So you have to create your own folder. I've created a binder, and I think if we ever moved, or I would give it to the next person who lived here, and they'd have a nice little history of their house. And then you can share that history with your town historian or your historical society, and they can have that folder in their archive. So if someone does come in to ask about your property in the future, we don't have folders for every property, but we just happen to have one about this property because that person who lived there did a nice job researching it. So you can share that history with other people. And if you want to find out who's haunting your house, this might be a good starting point. But thanks for listening in. If you have any questions about further questions about researching your house, doing the genealogy of your house, so to speak, or your property, please let me know. Or if you have any comments about your personal experience doing this, let me know. And again, thanks for joining in, and we'll see you next time.